This is Stealth on Health with Mario Nasinovich. Envisioned by the people, voiced by the people, powered by the people, it's everyday people with extraordinary values that make up New Right Network. Welcome to the healthcare voice of New Right Network. This is Stealth on Health, and I'm Mario Nasinovich. Joining me for episode number 11 is one of our most talented and ambitious colleagues I've ever had the chance to work with, and I hope she will inspire you to really think deeply about the most talented individuals in our midst every day. That certainly brings substantial value to our lives and to our overall healthcare ecosystem. She is a biomedical scientist and a medical writer that received her undergraduate technology degree in biotechnology at what is now the Sam Higginbotham University of Agriculture, Technology, and Sciences, formerly the Allahabad Agricultural Institute in Allahabad, Uttar Pradesh, India. She continued her studies at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, and obtained her Master of Science in Biology, specifically in the area of molecular biology. Not an easy subject, people. She has her PhD in immunology and infectious diseases from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, where she conducted some very important research in Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which we will talk about in the show today. We recently had the opportunity to collaborate in our recent roles working in medical communications, and she and I shared some just incredible moments and some great projects together. And I'd like to welcome you to the 11th episode of Stealth and Health, Dr. Sheetal Verma.
Very, very humbled and honored to be here, Mario. Thank you for having me. It's a beautiful day out there, and let's talk about how science rules the world.
That is absolutely true. And what I failed to mention as well, this is a first for me. So I have absolutely never, in any of my capacities before, interviewed a former co-worker. So you are the first person I have ever interviewed. Well, whether I was editor-in-chief of Journal Communication in Healthcare and some of the other communication roles that I've been in, you are the first. So hopefully we can set this benchmark extremely high, as I know we will. But thank you for coming on, and certainly I want to start off really at the earliest part of your life, and really think about your earliest recollection of anything scientific, anything medical that came from your childhood, and how that really inspired you to really pursue what you've pursued in terms of an incredible career in STEM.
We've been hearing a lot about this one word last few days, especially, which is called privilege. And I don't know how most people interpret it, but I interpret privilege as a blessing. And I would say that I am extremely privileged and blessed to be born into a family of scientists and academics. So both my parents are scientists. My mom is a sociologist, and my dad was an entomologist. So, discussions around science in the household were very organic. Whether you were walking down the street, talking about birds and talking about cross-pollination of flowers, or you were in the kitchen and talking about food experiments, it all flowed very naturally and organically. One of the funniest memories I have, and I've shared that with you, is watching this movie, The Mummy, back in 99. And, I was like a high schooler then. And there's a very scary scene. And trust me, I'm not the one for like any horror stuff.
I'm with you.
And there's a scene with primordial insects coming out of a crypt and about to eat a person. And my dad goes, "Oh, I bet these are from this taxonomical family, and this is their subspecies and genus." And I'm like, "You gotta be kidding me." So
just ruin the moment, Dad.
Thank you very much. Thanks, but no thanks. Yeah. But that was a level of like science for us. We in everyday life, science always surrounded me, and I think becoming a scientist was almost a no-brainer.
Wow. And just being part of who you are in the everyday conversation certainly made it very, very easy. But, you had a decision to make coming out of high school, and you had to determine what you wanted to do with your life. Certainly no easy tasked with such accomplished parents, what spurred you to pursue an undergraduate technology degree in biotechnology?
So at the time when I finished high school, biotech was just picking up.
It was in
At
its
the
infancy. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. And, there was all of these buzz surrounding new startup biotechs, and Indian markets were now getting opened to foreign investments and such. So it was quite an exciting time for a young person like myself. And I always knew that I loved life sciences and life science, reading about biology and biological systems. So I decided to go to Allahabad and pursue my undergrad degree in biotech. It's one of the premier institutes for agricultural sciences, and they had just started this program of a 4-year degree in biotechnology. So it was just the cosmos worked in my favor and got me there.
It's an amazing story, and certainly at the right place at the right time
But
for it. And with so much innovation happening around us at that time, no shortage of examples of what you could ultimately potentially do with that career. So, in terms of next steps, certainly a lot to choose from. But why did you become a biomedical scientist, and what drew you to this field when really there were so many different things that could be done?
correct, correct. So, of course, there was a partiality in the household for agricultural sciences,
I could only imagine what that pressure was like.
but I think what that does to you is like, especially at that age when you're like in your late teens, you want to do everything that you're not want to do everything that your parents want you to do.
Actually, the complete opposite of absolutely.
Let me
Yeah.
take a full 180
Yeah.
because that's exactly what I want to do. So being at Allahabad and being, constantly around agricultural scientists, I knew that I was not that interested in plant sciences and botany per se. But what really excited me was this short-term course that I did at one of the premier institutes in India called the National Institute of Immunology in New Delhi. And they did a little trainer slash refresher course for young scientists and young students going into the field of STEM. And you could run experiments, and you could see DNA, and you could run some gels and visualize it under the X-ray. So that really was like the pivoting point. It really got me very intrigued. Throughout my degree program, I did multiple internships at leading biotech institutes in the country, and that sort of strengthened my resolve to pursue my career in biomedical sciences, because I feel like it's such a good amalgam of medicine and science,
Hmm.
and it gives you the best of both worlds.
No, I think that there's some important pearls there that for any of our younger listeners that I really want to stress here. And this is key, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sheetal, but you also were able to determine what you wanted to do by being clear as to what you didn't want to do.
Absolutely. And, process of elimination is very important. And a lot of times as mentors or teachers, even parents, we don't emphasize that enough. So a lot of times, young children and young adults know very clearly that, whether they want to pursue arts or sciences or tech or
Well,
law
they
or
think they do. Yeah.
right. But there's a lot of strength in knowing what you don't want to do. And
Absolutely.
that can, in more ways than one, steer you in the right direction.
And
And one of the other bottom lines I feel is also asking why do you want to do a certain thing versus why not.
right.
So that also helps in the decision making process.
No, and I love that, and I think you're spot on. It is the process of elimination. Now, you said something that was critically important as well, and for those of us that have grown up in the American education system, I'm not sure they're fully aware of the number of institutes as well as the role of the institutes within India as well as other countries around the world. And really, this is really the breeding ground in a lot of places to inspire young scientists to really chart their course together, and they kind of get to know you, know your name, and have a watchful eye for you. So tell us a little bit about that part of the experience, because it's almost like being in the equivalency of a farm system where and certainly agricultural jokes aside from your parents, but in terms of a sports analogy, you're in a farm system where you've been identified as a top talent, and someone takes an interest in your career, and you continue to get invitations back to these institutes. Can you explain a little bit about your experience with that?
Right, absolutely. And I think anybody who's ever pursued a educational program will come back and tell you that, these kind of mentoring opportunities, or getting mentored opportunities, as I would say, are very critical in how you visualize your career, what you see yourself doing. So a lot of the research universities in India now, and even in the past, have had tie-ups with either universities abroad or research institutes within the country and hospital systems within the country, where students get invited to do observership internships and can get a real know-how of what everyday real life scenario looks like. Because it's all right to read about molecular biology in a book, right? And it's all good and all hunky-dory to read about genetics in a book. But when you go to the actual real life scenario, where you're able to either look at an animal experimental model or even plant sciences and look at how genetics works and how molecular biology works and how immunology works, it's all like that reaffirms your conviction. And I think that's what is key.
And you get to see it. And
yeah, seeing is believing, right?
Most definitely. So I want to take you back to 2007. This was an incredible year for you. You make your way, your journey, your career path takes you to the United States, and you continue your studies in an unfamiliar place. Let's just put it that way. Cleveland, Ohio. I can't think of something further remote from your upbringing. And you pursue your Master of Science in biology there, which is a very interesting pivot for you. You begin to focus much more in molecular biology at Case Western Reserve University. How did you come up with your hypothesis on the role of GAP2 phosphorylation sites in hematopoietic signaling, and what got you interested in this area? But before we get into that and get into the findings and how it added to the literature, talk about a young girl with her undergraduate degree coming from India and landing in Cleveland, Ohio. Let's tell a little bit about that story.
It's interesting to say the least. Very, very polar opposite of what I was used to. So mind you, I'm coming from New Delhi, which is capital of India, one of the most populous cities in the world. Hustle, bustle, constant lights and sounds, and you have family and friends. And then I land in Ohio, where you could not see anybody on the road after 7 p.m.
Yep.
So it was definitely a culture shock.
Wow.
And a reverse culture shock, because for most people, a culture shock is going from a smaller place to a more melting pot kind of a big city environment. For me, it was reverse. I went from a big city to a much smaller town.
And certainly, we're not insulting any of the beautiful people that live in.
No, certainly
They're a small town, but compared to New Delhi, you are absolutely irrelevant. You could probably not fit in a portion of the city, and your population would be forgotten in the city of New Delhi.
Completely.
That's perspective.
That is perspective.
But
perspective. What Cleveland did not have in hustle and bustle and energy, they made it up in warmth. I have never met more warmer people and more welcoming people ever.
Present company excluded, though, right? We have that disclaimer on.
Yeah, present company absolutely excluded.
So,
only talking about past references.
This is 2007, not 20.
Yes.
Oh,
no.
So
what Cleveland did for me was to give me this very protected, very homely environment where everybody knew everybody was interested in each other's progress, whether it's your thesis advisor or your graduate degree program coordinator, or even I taught an undergrad lab for 3 years, and my students were even interested on what I was doing next. And, so I think I tremendously appreciate being in Cleveland for that. It was quite enriching to get that homely, warm feeling.
So, how did you come up with your hypothesis? And did you go into your program at Case Western with that kind of idea and that inspiration? And what led you to pursuing your research in this area?
Sure. So, a couple of things that I was very clear on, and I must thank my dad for that, is he always encouraged that, it's no point doing something which is just very theoretical in its concept. You need to do and learn and educate yourself in something which has practical application. So I wanted to pursue either regenerative medicine with stem cell technology or cancer research. And it was one of the guest lecture seminars that I was, with free food that I was attending during one of my classes. And I met my thesis advisor, and he was working on this leukemia cellular signaling model that got me very interested to work with him. And literally we had a discussion, and he told me to come into his office the next day. And the third day I had a position where he wanted me to do research for him.
Amazing.
So it was very meant to be kind of a way that I landed in this research project. And what got me really interested was that we were part of the Case Comprehensive Cancer Center, which is one of the most highly acclaimed National Cancer Research Institute in the country. And we were surrounded by brilliant and extremely well research clinicians and scientists all the time. So it was a constant back and forth of an amazing amount of information, whether it was for solid tumors or leukemia. And when I started working on this project, I had never worked on a cell signaling project before, but I had so much help and mentorship from everybody around me that it just felt very organic and it flowed. Yeah.
And we're going to dig into that a little bit later in our program. I know this may be beyond the reach, and certainly we don't want to insult anyone that may be watching the program. But tell us a little bit about the importance of your key finding and what that added to the literature, because you did want it to be beyond the theoretical as your dad had hoped.
Sure. Yeah. So what we did was we looked at these cellular signaling pathways that are dysregulated in certain types of leukemia, especially acute myeloid leukemias.
So that's AML, if anybody's...
AML. That's right. And we wanted to see that if you disrupt these pathways, does that impact the cellular growth of the cancer? Mm-hmm. Or does it have no impact on it? So that was really the hypothesis that we went in with. And what I did was I biochemically confirmed that sure enough, when you do block some of these signaling pathways, there's an impact on the growth of the cancer cells, which actually makes these pathways a very interesting target for therapy. So that was what the key finding was, that, and the lab has actually gone on to publish quite a bit on these pathways ever since, where these are potentially very good therapeutic targets for restricting cancer growth in leukemia models.
Mm-hmm. So I know we're going to keep politics out of our conversation here today, but I need to ask how important is it that we maintain funding for this type of research at the university level?
It is so important that there's not a word in the English language that will describe how important it is.
I love that. And I hope people listen to that, because, when we think about funding and we think about what comes next, whatever this I'm not going to use those words that everyone keeps using in the media. In terms of new normal, we're not using that here. You didn't hear that. But in terms of post-pandemic, what we need to think about is how we do preserve the funding for some of that basic science and some of that translational research that's so critically important. And that's happening within the hallowed halls of so many universities and so many research labs within the United States and around the world. But for those of people like yourself that are pursuing great science and great research that is going to add to the literature, that's going to be an important seminal moment in research that people could then take and do other great work with, like your lab has done, that may lead to some type of treatment. It starts with people like you. It starts with that vision. It starts with that hypothesis, and we need to continue to support that. So I know that wasn't part of our discussion today, but I felt it was a moment where we definitely needed.
No, it certainly is. It certainly is, and it's very important for everyday people to really understand why it is so important to fund science and technology research.
And I think people are getting a little bit more exposed to that
Yeah,
in our pandemic. They're seeing that you could have 100 potential treatment options, and how many various vaccines, and how many antibody tests and diagnostic tests. These are things that people are talking about over their dining room table over dinner now, where just a few short months ago they've never heard of these type of things. Their doctor sent them for a test. What was the test? Well, what was the specificity and the susceptibility, and they never heard about these terms, and we're hearing about it on the nightly news. So I think we've certainly raised the level of awareness, but all of this has a starting point, and it is started with people like yourself that are at the age and the have the curiosity, have the background, that are going to continue making these discoveries, and that funding has to come from someplace. So it's critically important that we continue to make that investment. Speaking of investment, certainly you took the opportunity and the understanding and the wealth of knowledge that you gathered at Case Western and stayed here in the U.S. to continue to pursue continued learning, and you moved to New Jersey. Again, the culture shock after culture shock. It just is amazing to me. But you pursued your PhD in immunology and infectious diseases at Rutgers. And let's talk about it, because I know we've spent days talking about this together.
right.
Your research into mycobacterium tuberculosis, or we'll call it NTB going forward, the transmission dynamics, the protection against infection. Why is this important now more than ever?
Yeah, yeah. So I think this was in my first year of PhD while I was at Rutgers, and the program was structured as an interdisciplinary program. So you could, in your first year, you could rotate with multiple labs and really choose which part of the biomedical field appealed to you the most. And I remember this as yesterday. I'm sitting in the lecture hall, and this professor comes in who is a professor emeritus. He's doing this immunology class, Immunology 101. And the first thing he says, if you have Kobe's immunology textbook from 2010 or 2009, please throw it because it's no longer relevant.
Wow.
And I mean, if you were busy playing on your computer or listening to music, or whatever you were doing, being distracted as a student in that class, that sentence got everybody's attention, because that's how dynamic this field is that nothing about the human body, especially the immune system, is well understood or even well captured in textbooks, and it's constantly changing, it's constantly evolving based on the environment that we live in. So I was just extremely fortunate that I met my thesis advisor at the time during my first year of classes, and I was like, oh, can I come visit your lab and what you work on, and can I rotate with you for a few weeks? And she was like, sure, we work on tuberculosis. And the first reaction you get when you say, to people, I work on TB, is, oh, really? Does TB still exist?
With
And
that head tilt, right? Like, oh,
yeah,
yeah. It's like,
yeah. And it's a genuine question, don't get
yeah.
me wrong. Like they don't know. And it it actually gives you a little bit of air about yourself to say, yes, it does. And not only does it do exist, it kills. And it kills only second to HIV as the single most pathological and mortality causing infectious agent in the world. So, so this is not an obsolete disease by any means.
Right.
And why transmission dynamics is, it's this is the perfect time to talk about transmission dynamics.
I could not emphasize it any
Right?
better. Yes.
Yeah, you can write papers and you can write book chapters on transcription dynamics, but this is the perfect real life example that we have in front of us.
So let me take pause there. For anybody that is watching right now, I want you to think about everything you've heard about how COVID-19 is transmitted. Okay, how touching things, and we're going to cover this in our next episode with regards to nutrition and go inside the supermarket and talk about the home, and we will certainly talk a lot about all of the ways that things can be transmitted. But think about what you're doing now in terms of wearing masks and standing 6 feet away from each other, and perhaps not going to be able to go to your places of worship. While the science of what we are going to touch upon here may be something that you may say, well, this is way beyond me. You're living it right now. So I invite you all to pay a little bit closer attention to what we're about to talk about and Dr. Verma is about to share, because she was working on transmission dynamics, people, before it was cool. So, Sheetal, please share with our listeners everything that there is to know why this is so critical. And we couldn't, if we did this a couple of months ago and had this interview, people would have been lost on it. But today, this is so critically important, and you can draw some real unbelievable parallels for people.
Right, right. So it's important to start from the very top. So let's go 30,000 feet in the air and then start going down, right? So macro view of how infectious diseases work is that, yes, you have a pathogen and you have a disease causing organism, whether it's a bacteria or a virus or a fungus, and they move from host to host causing disease. That's infectious disease 101. Now, what makes infectious diseases complex, it's not just the fact that, yes, there is a disease causing organism causing either tuberculosis or causing COVID-19 or causing influenza. There's also comorbidities. So, you could be sick and having cardiovascular disease or diabetes or Parkinson's. And you could be poor and living in a lower socioeconomic background,
It's
right?
also determinants of health. Yeah.
Absolutely. Or you could be living in a country where parasites are endemic or where HIV is endemic. Or you could be living in very close quarters with your family, which majority of the world does. And due to economic restrictions or whatever other circumstances, you might not have access to clean water and nutritious food. And now you have a real storm brewing at your hands, because all of these factors contribute to your immunity in how your body will fight the infection. And it's such a delicate balance of everything going in sync that the moment you take one thing off, the whole system collapses. And let's not also forget that all of us jet setters and world travelers are to thank for not only damaging the ozone layer, but also taking all of these germs and pathogens from one part of the world to the other.
We are the carriers.
We are the carriers, both figuratively and literally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So highly contagious diseases such as COVID, influenza, and TB and even SARS and MERS and Ebola are all based on the center of the storm. And what governs the storm, or what is the eye of the storm, is how transmission works. So whether it's through cough, whether it's through bodily fluids, whether it's through excretory material, whatever it may be that is causing this pathogen to move from one host to the other, it's extremely important to understand what drives transmission, because till the time you get to that, you will not be able to contain the infection.
Absolutely. So that's the transmission part.
Yeah.
And that couldn't, if people couldn't wrap their heads around that part and the work that you did in that area, and we'll get into some of those details momentarily,
Yeah.
you didn't stop there. So it wasn't just the transmission dynamics. You also then also considered, how do you protect against these things?
Right.
So bring that all together for our folks. I like your 30,000 foot view, and I thought you did that very beautifully. How can we talk about the protection part of this?
Sure. So any infectious disease research is really based on a few core principles, a few core factors that would drive any infectious disease research. The number one question is, how does any pathogen infect the host? So what is the mechanism? How does it get into the body, whether it's through the nose, whether it's through blood, whether it's through saliva, what is it? The second factor to consider is, how is this infection established within the host? Does the pathogen infect the gut first and then it goes all the way all around the body? Does it go into the lungs first? What are the target organs? And third, and most importantly, is, why do some people get sick and other people don't?
$1 million question.
And that is the holy grail. That is the absolute holy grail, right? So what we did was, we took these observations that we had seen in people infected with TB, and through our transmission dynamics study, and then we extrapolated them into an experimental model where we tested to see pathologically what are the reasons why some types of TB strains transmit more and others don't.
Yeah.
And what it comes down to really, in one word, is your host immunity is what governs everything. So yes, the pathogen has a role to play, and it will trigger certain things in you, and it won't trigger certain things in other people. But it's your own immunity and how you combat the infection is what really determines that.
So these topics, ladies and gentlemen, are more important than ever, because as beautifully and as eloquently and as simply as Sheetal has stated this is exactly what we're doing right now within our current pandemic. We are trying to understand the transmission dynamics, and frankly, a lot of time and energy and a lot of bright minds are thinking about these issues. At the same time, running a parallel track to not knowing all of those answers, we're trying to protect against, we're trying to treat, we're trying to prevent, we're trying to do a number of things. And different people are doing different research in these different areas. What you need is somebody like Sheetal, who had the vision to sit there and say, how does this all work? So think about, if we're seeing firsthand eyewitness accounts on a daily basis, how challenging it is to break this down. Sheetal and her colleagues and her mentor were able to map this in MTB. And in terms of the real world application, I think it may be obvious to some, Sheetal, but please lay it out for us. How important is this, and what's the real world application for your work from MTB right here, right now?
Sure. One of the most important things to understand is that both COVID and tuberculosis are transmitted via aerosolized droplets. Yep. So they are both airborne, which essentially means that if you cough and sneeze, and if you are infected, that's how you will spread the infection to other people. So they are respiratory pathogens. They infect your lungs primarily, and both of these pathogens lead to what is called a hugely altered immune response within the host. So even though COVID is a virus and MTB is a bacteria, there are huge parallels to draw here. And one of the important real life applicability that I think a lot of scientists and clinicians across the world are trying to study is, how do we stop disease progression? And how can we enhance the host's ability to stop this disease progression? So
And
if
that's
I
really the key to it all.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So whether it's through vaccines, whether it's through prophylactic drugs, we need to be able to get to a point where even if I do get infected, I don't transmit it further.
Mm.
So, and these are all what we commonly call in science as obligate pathogens. So they always need a host to survive in. And that can work in our favor because they cannot just typically exist in the environment right now. And so if we are able to adequately treat and manage the infection while it's still within a host, we can really cut down that chain of transmission going forward from person to person. And that's where our answer lies.
That is. And in terms of how important your work was to fellow scientists to understand, and where your work stopped and others are continuing, how important is that part of really being able to? I know people have used the analogy of you're taking literally one grain of sand and putting it on top of a giant pile of sand pellets or on a beach. This was significantly bigger, but how important is it for other fellow scientists to now take that forward?
Yeah, very much, very important, I would say. Also, one of the interesting things that we did while I was still at Rutgers, and it's still continuing, is that all of the brightest and most gifted minds in tuberculosis research came together, and we formed what is now called the TB research units. So they are centers of excellence that exist throughout the country, and we work with countries across the world, South Africa, India, South Korea, Brazil, to name a few, and cross collaborate quite intensively. And I think that is the key. That is very, very evident right now with COVID research as well, where there's a global biorepository of data and information that scientists from across the world are sharing and really helping to come up with therapeutic and vaccination based answers on how to combat this infection. So I think the key here is, yes, we do research on the bench and we publish papers, but collaboration among like-minded people is extremely important, if not the only important thing in a pandemic such as this, to take that work forward, because
No.
you cannot exist in isolation.
And for people who don't understand, there may not be aware of the politics of academia and these laboratories. What I want you to take away from is this: we may be living in unprecedented times, as so many in the media and so many politicians have shared, but it is truly unprecedented what is happening in terms of the collaboration. We don't necessarily hear about it, and certainly in the last few weeks with some of the protesting and some of the other events that have unfolded, we have not heard about this. But in terms of what is happening from lab site to lab site, Sheetal mentioned this network of centers that is in collaboration right now, and the sharing of information. When you look back in history, 10, 15, 20 years from now, the opportunity for people to come together to share this knowledge, they will never be able to look back prior to this and say, oh, wow, this happened here in a moment that we needed it the most, where we broke down all barriers, where we left business cards and ego at the front door of the lab and really rolled up our proverbial lab coat sleeves to really come together and work together. I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Mark Cullen from Stanford, who's on the medical advisory board. Actually, he's chairing the medical committee with regards to the Stanford-led database and for COVID-19. And I can tell you sincerely, this is truly, truly unprecedented, where people are able to break down some of these barriers and focus on the issue. And it's going to take us all. It takes certainly a village, and in this case, I think when we think about the global nature of the pandemic, it's going to take a global effort of like-minded, brilliant people to really put aside even some of their areas of interest and their own research. And I think that's key too. That hasn't got a lot of press either. Looking at the clinical research that has occurred or has not occurred or has been paused or maybe not initiated. A lot of different companies and a lot of different laboratories have taken their work and have shelved it temporarily or have set their plans on pause for initiating other research to focus on this. And I don't know of another time in history where that has been done. And it is just an absolute awesome time to really be witnessing what science is doing in terms of coming together. So I think, Sheetal, you said it best. It is collaboration, but it is certainly a collaboration that has no necessarily pre-qualifications or any barrier. These are certainly people who are just willing to give their data, which we don't see. This doesn't happen.
No, it doesn't happen.
People sit in their labs working on their stuff, and you have your intellectual property
Right.
because that's your stuff. This
That,
is amazing. Yeah.
and getting scooped for all of your intellectual property is a very real thing. It has happened to many of us.
Yes.
But it is tremendous how great problems bring out the best in people.
And we have.
And this is the prime example of that.
No other time ever. And we've seen great success come from laboratories. I'm not putting down individual laboratory efforts. Certainly, we would not be where we are today in terms of being able to understand or combat disease if we did not have the amazing accomplishments of individual laboratories.
Yeah.
But think about the effort that's underway when you listen to this, and think about all of those people that are all trying to figure this out. We will overcome this, and we will overcome it together, which is an incredible, beautiful thing for humanity to do. And then we'll see what's lurking around the corner, because this is not something to rest on our laurels. Those of us who have studied certainly SARS and MERS and Ebola understand what this is all about. And for those of us that are old enough to even remember the first time we heard HIV, guess what? While we are seeing people survive and thrive, they're going to outsmart us. There's always something lurking that's bigger, meaner, and nastier, and we'll be there, and humanity will come together. That is the beautiful part of what's happening here.
Absolutely.
And while we're all kind of focused, let's call it extremely focused, Sheetal, on the current pandemic, let's back this up, because I don't think people understand, to your most beautiful way of sharing this before, the assessment of the current state of tuberculosis in the United States. This isn't a disease that has gone away or is rested. This is the second leading cause of death, as you said it, globally after HIV from an infectious standpoint.
Right.
Where are we? What's the current state of TB in the U.S.?
So just last week, I was up in Lake Saranac in upstate New York. And if you ever have the pleasure of going there, there's Trudeau Institute, which has what are now called cure cottages. So this is from the 1800s, where people with TB used to come to Lake Saranac to get treatment and to get better because the air quality was so good. So TB has been around for more than a century, and this is recorded history, what I'm talking about. There is evidence from the pharaohs and ancient Egypt that there was a debilitating disease that used to lead to wasting of people. And
That's more than 100 years, though.
yeah, that's like from thousands, multiple recorded evidence that suggests that TB has existed for as long as we knew of infection and contagions.
Yeah.
So the go-to line for any tuberculosis researcher is TB anywhere is TB everywhere. So even if one person has the disease, they are a potential reservoir to transfer it to however many people. And diseases and the immune system never exist in isolation, and that is what is very important to understand, that you cannot just work on the pathogen and you cannot just work on the human immune system. You have to look at them as two pieces of the puzzle.
This
And
is
that's
a full picture here. Yeah.
absolutely. So whether you are in the US, and have unfortunately have a rheumatoid arthritis, if you travel to India or if you travel anywhere where there's TB and TB is endemic, you will have to really talk to your rheumatologist when you come back, because you could be potentially exposed to TB.
Amazing.
And that can really alter your system's response to rheumatoid arthritis or psoriasis for that matter. So nobody is safe from infectious diseases, and that's what people need to understand, that even though in the US you don't see as many tuberculosis cases being reported, in this world and era of globalization, you are at risk of exposure. So it is important to understand how this disease works and how it can be controlled.
So you talked a little bit about how people with TB are literally at risk in terms of rheumatoid arthritis. But really, let's talk first, I guess, a little bit more about how we talked about the transmission dynamics. How are TB and COVID-19 similar, and how are they different? These are very different pathogens, they're very, very different diseases, but what's similar about them and what's different?
So I touched that earlier, where the most crucial similarity is that they are both respiratory. So you inhale them, and that's how you get infected.
At least that's what we think today.
Yes.
That's
You never know what we're going to find out.
Wait till tomorrow.
By the time tomorrow's newspaper rolls around. So that is the most striking similarity between these two infectious diseases. Also, what is important to know is that how these respiratory pathogens alter your immune system and how they kind of micromanage your immune system very smartly. So one thing I would always say to my students is, pathogens have brains. Even though if you don't see them, that doesn't mean they don't have brains.
They have bad behaviors too.
These are infectious agents that have existed for billions of years. So let's not kid ourselves. They are very smart organisms. They know how to evolve. They know when to lie dormant. They know when to activate. And I think that's another striking similarity between COVID and TB, is that both pathogens, even though they are bacterial and virus in nature, they are able to very quickly adapt to their environment. And they are changing. Let's not kid ourselves. They are changing.
And we've heard about some of the mutations with COVID-19.
Yes, and we need to think 2 steps ahead of the disease if we really want to combat the rate of infection and the rate of mortality and morbidity associated with these.
No, we do. I want to make this very, very personal for a moment. For people that are out there that really want to understand the impact here in terms of a positive diagnosis of tuberculosis. People are out there. We know they're among us, and certainly some are asymptomatic. Some have been diagnosed, and some of them have certainly been going through the process of treatment. Yeah. In terms of their increased risk for COVID-19 infection, illness, and even death, what have you seen?
I would say that it looks very critical. And they are at a critical juncture where people who either have tuberculosis or have had respiratory illnesses in the past are at are at a greater risk. Right at the top of my head, I don't have statistical data to support this, but I know there's enough literature findings that are suggesting that if you have rare lung illnesses or have been exposed to respiratory viruses, that has sort of already caused
Whole milieu.
deterioration
Yeah.
of sorts in your lung function.
Yeah.
And now you get a further insult to injury by getting exposed to COVID. And that might just push you over the edge.
Yeah.
So that's why I said, even if you've had TB in the past, or if you've had COPD, or if you've had interstitial lung disease, or are a chain smoker, those things may not be very obviously related right now, but again, like I said, the body works in unison. And here you are already having an organ that might have compromised function, and now it getting exposed to COVID will most likely push you over the edge. So it's very important to really understand the risks involved.
And certainly you and I have talked about for hours about ILD and the
Right.
complications along with that, as well as the overall morbidity and mortality. To throw COVID-19 on top of that situation certainly can prove fatal. Um, I'm concerned about our health authorities and what they can do to provide some level of sustainability of essential TB services. We're almost hyper focused on COVID 19, but there's essential TB services that are desperately needed during the COVID 19 pandemic. What services can be leveraged across even potentially both diseases, as far as you know?
Um, I would think the first thing that comes to mind is personal protective gear. And a lot of the PPE that is being used for COVID has been traditionally used for respiratory illnesses in the past. So there's a very big overlap between those kind of services that can be provided to frontline workers and scientists and people working with tuberculosis. Um, and also, the other thing to understand is one of the biggest tools that we can equip ourselves in today's day and age is information, and
Yeah.
scientifically astute information at that. So it's important to take lessons learned from TB and from other respiratory infectious diseases that have occurred in the past and still exist, and extrapolate them onto emerging pathogens such as COVID-19. And I think those lessons are very valuable.
Yeah, and I think back to just what probably about a month ago when you and I were speaking about this, and the measures that already exist here to
Right.
protect staff working in TB laboratories and healthcare facilities. So that's the other part of this. I think most people listening don't understand because they haven't seen it or heard it from the media. We're not doing everything new in this pandemic. There are certain best practices that have been seen in the TB laboratories as well as healthcare facilities, even with regards to putting PPE on correctly. And I
Correct.
think we talked about that, and you were certainly quite passionate about how important essential gear is, having access to that gear, and knowing how to physically put that on. I mean, we joked about some of the screening sites that we saw and what people were doing. Even in some of the protests that we've seen people even wearing just their masks below their nose.
Absolutely.
Talk about these measures that are being used for COVID infection. What are some of the best lessons you've learned from working in a TB laboratory, and what does the average person need to know about the best practices that have been long established?
Sure. Um, I think I will preface this part of the discussion by saying that there's a lot of information out there, but one, information needs to come from reliable sources.
Agree
And
100%.
secondly, and importantly, um, there are many well-trained individuals that exist in our society, but I think there needs to be a grassroots level movement to use those resources to cause to lead to more widespread education.
Yeah, agreed.
Because just handing a pair of gloves and a mask to a common person sure is a very good thing, but it's like you know you are bringing a knife to a gunfight.
Yeah.
You even though you have the weapon, you don't know how to use it, and that actually can be more hazardous to you than not having one in the first place. So as TB researchers and as infectious disease scientists, we have gone through rigorous training that has lasted for months in how to wear PPE and how to decontaminate ourselves when we are done with our experiments and testing. And I feel like those resources can be really tapped in by the government and by our city council people and other people in a position of power.
It's certainly the media to convey that message.
Correct. And then use that to actually educate lay people and common everyday folks in how to wear a glove, how to remove a glove, how to wear a mask, what to do, what not to do. So there's plenty of resource out there. I think now we are at a stage in this pandemic where we really need to tap into those people, such as myself and my colleagues. And there are many people who would be more than willing to come forward and help. And that's how we make this a global community-centered effort.
And that is what's needed now more than ever. And that takes us all the way back to the first part of our conversation, where it was so critically important that you not study something and not pursue something theoretical and make it very, very practical. These are some of the practical things that need to be done and that we need to do right here, right now, to help people. And I certainly encourage anyone who's listening that if you have a voice, if you have the resources and the connections to help advance this, certainly we have many people like Sheetal who are willing to help that out, that have the experience. If we want to talk about what PPE is and how we use it to the best of our ability, take it from somebody who's worked in a TB lab. Trust me, they are going to get that right. They don't want to catch TB. So I think these are wise lessons learned and will help us all move forward. I want to shift gears to talk about some of your more recent work, and certainly some of the work that I was able to witness firsthand. Tell us about your work in medical communications, and as you do, first define medical communications for those people who don't know what that is. They may think it's a prescription they receive from the doctor. Hopefully it's an electronic prescription. Not many people are writing anymore.
Right, hopefully.
So minimize errors that way. But let's talk about medical communications, if you could define that, and then tell us more about some of the more recent projects, which I think we've already gotten a little bit of an insight to, because I think you've left a nice little breadcrumb along the way with certain things. But wrap that all up for us.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. So it's interesting. I've used quite a few analogies when I think about medical communications, but I think one of my favorite ones still remains, and it's very scientific, of course, is the stem of a brain cell. So for those of us who don't know what a neuron looks like, it looks like a little fried egg on the top, with a string running at the bottom. And that string is what connects it to another neuron. And it's through that string is where information is passed on from one cell to the other. So when I think of medical communications, I think of that brain cell, because you have healthcare and you have pharmaceutical R&D and you have product development, all centered in that one fried egg. And you have medical communicators such as yourself and me who take that information from one source to the other. So we are, what I would like to say, a bridge between medicine and science. And that's why we are very critical, because otherwise science and medicine don't talk to each other. It is through people like us who work with scientists and clinicians and who translate that science into more digestible bits is how these two worlds coexist.
And that is a beautiful definition of that that I think everybody can relate to. You're making me hungry though, so I need to share that with you. I haven't had lunch yet.
Uh-oh.
But tell us a little bit more about your recent projects and certainly maintaining client confidentiality. You've worked in a number of amazing areas that are under development. Share a little bit about this, and for anybody that may be interested in a career in medical communications, there's no better opportunity than to take a listen and hear what that's like.
Um, Again, when I was doing science, I always had the fortune of meeting these brilliant scientists and doctors and epidemiologists who would talk about great ideas, but sometimes fall short in adequately communicating it and sharing it with other people. And I think that was my real motivator to get into this career and pivot into medical communications. Um, One of my most favorite projects has been doing a disease state analysis and overview for a client of ours working again, shocker, in asthma. Respiratory diseases are my
I
favorite.
wonder why we asked you to work on that.
Wonder why.
Wonder why. Yeah.
Yeah. So, um, as most of our listeners today would probably know, that asthma is a very complex disease and impacts millions of people, both pediatrics and adults.
And adults.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's very important to look at this disease from multifaceted lens of, it's, yes, it's a lung disease, but it's also an immune disease, and it's also a disease of the upper airways and the lower airways. So you have pulmonologists, you have allergists, you have ENTs, who are all part of your care team. And I think for one of my projects, what we did was that we got all of these specialists together and captured their viewpoint on how best to treat this disease, what are the modalities involved in treatment, and how we can use real world data in actual decision making for people who are prescribing medications, and also for patients to better understand how to manage their disease, which is critical. And it was really enriching and very enlightening to hear from all of these different thought leaders and a real Star Wars in their field, and how they look at the same problem so differently.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the beauty of it as a medical communicator, to adequately bring all of those viewpoints onto the same platform and make a cohesive story out of it.
And then our job just really begins because we then need to
Correct.
communicate that simply and often, and certainly to different stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem, such as our viewers. We may have a nurse, we may have a medical student, we may have a caregiver, a mom, a dad, a sister, brother, aunt or uncle, grandparents. Certainly, a lot of different people wearing a lot of different roles in the lives of their loved ones or their patients, and we are the conduit for that communication, and that's what Celton Health is built on. We want to educate, inform, and entertain, and hopefully through a program like this, we're able to do a little bit of each. Never want to be too heavy-handed in one area or the other. Hopefully, you've enjoyed part of this journey with us here today to hear a little bit about the life and times, as well as the enriching parts of the research and the work that Dr. Verma has done. But she's always been somebody who has had an eye to also give back. So this isn't somebody who's just a scientist in the lab, or somebody who's writing and worrying about how to communicate this research, or bringing together these landmark groups for a conversation. She's also been a mentor and a judge, specifically, and I would say probably for one of the most notable engineering and science fairs here in our area. She's also a reviewer for several journals. Without getting into those details, because while I think those are important, what's even more important are some of your guiding principles. Sheetal, can you tell us a little bit about the why behind you do all this?
Um, I think one of the most important guiding principles that I was taught and my grandfathers and great grandfathers were taught before me, I think, is to give back. We cannot enjoy the fruits and the accomplishments and the luxuries of our life without acknowledging that there was a whole village of people and whole plethora of mentors and teachers and brothers and sisters and family who really uplifted us and strengthened us to get to where we are. And I think giving back to the community is the absolute must for me. So hence the teaching, hence the mentoring, hence the judging. That's probably the least I can do
Yeah.
to really honor all my mentors and my teachers that have guided me throughout my career and my life. And I would like to say that, there's no better feeling than giving back.
And people
There's no
don't
better.
understand, if you give of yourself, the it comes back to you tenfold. And I always was instructed, actually, not always, uh, but to give back and to consider where you're going to be giving your time, and then to give it all your heart. And I remember one of my teachers in grammar school. She said you can give with your mind and your heart, but always be careful about what you're giving with your mouth, because it may be misunderstood or misinterpreted. But if all
Right.
of those are in alignment, it is truly what giving is, and it is a gift,
Correct.
and should be well received. But then I was educated by one of our former colleagues. We were talking about altruism, and certainly as a group, we had done a lot of charitable work, and we were graced with a tremendous humanitarian award
Mhm.
for our office and for our firm at our former company. And she presented me with some words of wisdom and said, I don't know why they call it altruism, because there isn't anything that could ever be purely altruistic, because even if your intentions are completely objective, you're always going to wind up getting more out of it than you put into it.
Yeah.
And for those of you that may be holding back and not thinking about somebody else in need, whether it be a friend, a neighbor, certainly at this time, thinking about if you are able and can go even to your local store, think about that person that may be in isolation, that can't, or who may be shuttering in place. Think about even just reaching out to them, say, hey, do you need milk? Do you need eggs? It's those little things that bring the humanity back into what we're doing.
Absolutely.
And I think it sends the right message that somebody else will then take and pay forward. And we've got to restore that more than anything else in this community at this day and age,
Yeah.
not just in our local, but we do these things right locally. We do these things right interpersonally, and it does have a ripple effect. People admire that, they imitate it, and there's no greater mentor or imitator that I think most people can hope for than someone like yourself, Sheetal, who's done so much for so many. And I want to talk about that, and I think this is the moment that's right for it. There's a message out there. There's a message to really inspire students, inspire young professionals, whether they be here or around the world, looking to come to the United States like you did, if they're looking to pursue a similar path that you did. Certainly, it's not an easy one to imitate at all. What's your message to them?
Never give up. Never give up. The possibilities are endless. The opportunities are mind boggling, but you have to persevere. You have to keep trying till you succeed. This is an unprecedented era we live in. Women in science and STEM fields are doing so well. We have broken stereotypes.
Amen.
We have shattered the ceiling. The sky is the limit. So I think the message that I would like to give is be patient, always persevere, and never undervalue yourself. You are worth so much more than the world might make you think. And don't think about the haters, don't think about the naysayers. It is your time, and it is your time to shine.
And don't think about those people posing on Instagram or TikTok or doing. Listen, you are valuable, and I can't thank you more than the value that you have also provided in terms of friendship and inspiration for my own daughter who got to intern with us a while back, and that you certainly had an independent friendship. It's not like I put the two of you guys together; it just
Right.
happened organically. And for someone like you to be a role model and a mentor to others, and a friend for someone who is finishing up school, that is looking at graduate school and what the future holds. I can't think of a better role model, and certainly for anybody out there that's looking, what can I do? You need to have the confidence, like Sheetal Verma, to be able to pursue that, and don't stop, don't give up. We encourage that, we love that, we embrace that, and we need you. You may be the person that saves us in what may be coming next, and we want to inspire you to pursue that. There's no better time, no better place. And as Sheetal said, women in the field of STEM right now, let me tell you, these are people who are doing it, getting it done, and moving on to the next big thing. And people like Sheetal, guess what? If you put a barrier in front of her, you better be prepared to have another barrier next after that, because she's going to blow through that one. So some advanced planning is definitely recommended for any of the haters out there that are thinking about stopping any of these people, because they're more powerful than you. And we want to inspire you to have the confidence and to move things forward, because we need you desperately. I think when I start thinking about your personal and professional goals, I think of an incredible checklist. I think of literally you just sitting there, and that big check mark that gets to come out for everything that you've accomplished. In terms of your personal and professional goals going forward, what would you love to accomplish next?
I think I have to be honest to my own words and say that the sky is the limit, right? So
Beautiful.
professionally, I would say more of the same, and in a more scientifically adapt capacity, where I can bring in my know-how and my education into really rendering scientific strategy forward for the different clients and the different brands that I work with. Always keeping in mind that it is the betterment of the end user, the betterment of the patient is what our focus should be. We are doing all of this so that the lives of the patients are healthier and better. And I think that should be at the core of all that we do as communicators and as scientists. Um, Personally, I think, again, more of the same, where give back to the community, pay it forward, um, keep providing love and warm hugs to anybody and everybody who needs it.
At a
And
distance, though, 6 feet distance, right? That's
yeah, well, virtual
air
hugs is what
hugs.
we're going for.
Yeah, yeah.
And always try to
Or
be,
if you're in PPE, that's okay, right?
that's true. That's true. Yeah. Um, and always try to be a positive influence as much as possible. Bring out the positivity, always try to look for the good in people.
And that is something you do every single day. I can attest to that from
I
a
try.
health standpoint. You have a mantra that I absolutely love, and in light of everything going on in the midst of our world today, and who knows where we are tomorrow, can you share this with our audience?
Certainly. It's definitely something that I found very inspirational. It's from Daniel Mohanin, who is a ex-US senator and a very
From New
prominent,
York. From New York, yeah.
yeah, and a prominent figure in the Nixon administration. And what he said was that each of us are entitled to our opinions, but we are not entitled to our own facts. And that really drives me, because every decision that we take, whether it's professionally, personally, for ourselves, for our families, for the community, has to be rooted in facts. We cannot change the facts that surround us. We can have an opinion about them, but we always need to remind ourselves that facts are facts, and that should be what should govern our decision making.
I could not agree more. And as the individual behind Stealth on Health, I know that you know that that is a mantra that I have adopted. And whether we're educating, informing, or entertaining, or all three, We need to base what we're saying on facts. There's
Sure.
enough fake news out there with every angle, but what you will hear here, and my promise to you, as we talk to guests every single day, we are going to be rooted in the science. We're going to be rooted in the facts, and we are going to be open and honest. When we don't know what we don't know, we will tell you. And I
And
think
there is no shame in accepting that.
there
There's no shame in accepting what we don't know, because that's how you will come to know what you don't know.
absolutely, and we will find out more, and we will certainly clarify things along the way together, and bring on experts like Sheetal Verma who can tell us what she's done and what you then can take from what she's learned and take that forward because that's critically important. And she can also share with you, as she has, as to what hasn't worked or what may not have been as successful as planned, and learn from that so that you don't have to go and waste your time going through the trials and tribulations. And I think that's an important part of the service that we're providing in terms of the inspiration that we're providing to you. And certainly you are incredibly inspiring, Dr. Verma. I've been filibustering a little bit here. This is episode 11, and certainly I've asked hundreds of questions of our guests along the way, and I've done a tremendous amount of research looking into the lives of people. This is possibly the toughest question I have to ask, but I think it's important that our audience gets to understand the context in which we have been speaking here. On a really deeply personal note, I have asked a lot of our guests. Many of them have lost colleagues, they've lost family, they've lost friends. Some have seen the passing of public figures, certainly that they've admired during this time. I saw a article today that not only have the excess deaths surged with regards to the pandemic, but things even like Alzheimer's has peaked during this time, which I think we need to look into much more, and concerns me. But and I say this with a very heavy heart, my friend. You lost your beloved papa during this time, and as best you can, I think it's important that people have heard a little bit about your story, a little bit about your time with your dad growing up. But tell us the story of your father, his legacy, your unbelievable relationship, and some of the unfortunate details of what you've experienced during this pandemic, not being able to see and physically be there to go and mourn.
Sure. Certainly, like you said, this is one of the most toughest things I've experienced in the last few weeks. And I would say that, I am my father's daughter, and I'm as proud of it as I can possibly be, because he and I were very alike. I am more of a reflection of him than I could ever imagined. He was an entomologist, also an agricultural scientist, an educator. And one of his most everlasting legacies is to keep the baton of going forward of education and of bringing in and really honing in talent in individuals, especially girls and young women, that he always held very dear to his heart. So he was very invested in doing educational programs for young children, and that is something that I'm going to carry forward. We are planning to start an educational scholarship in his name to honor his memory, for some of the underprivileged children in India. And his life was star-lined with achievements much greater than mine. And one of the things to get out of his life was, no matter what, always stay humble. So you could be the most brilliant mind in the room, and you could be gifted with wealth and luxuries, but always know that it is humility that is what people will remember you for. So I think that's his biggest legacy, and I hope that I can really give it its due and pay forward and really stay humble in spite of all accomplishments.
I'm speechless. Um, I thank you for sharing those thoughts. They're so warm and heartfelt. Um, Sheetal, let me open it up to you for the final word.
Um, Something you asked earlier was because of the pandemic, the difficulty that myself and the family went through. Even though his death was non-COVID, there was a lot of bureaucratic issues and travel restrictions that still exist. And of course, I had to think about my mom's safety because she's a chronic Parkinson's patient as well. So it's it's a very hard time, and I think the only lesson to get out of a time like this is empathy, because we always tell ourselves, oh, you will not understand what is happening till you're in those shoes. And let me tell you that I am in those shoes right now. And this kind of a tragedy really gives you the perspective that how fortunate and blessed we are, and we need to be extremely empathetic to the people around us and really embrace the differences that exist um, around us all the time, whether it's in education, whether it's in the color of your skin, whether it's in your gender and your sexual preferences, whether it is through luxury and your socioeconomic status, whatever the differences may be. As a species and as a race, we need to embrace those, because let me tell you, the planet is upset with us. And all of these things, the cyclones, the pandemic, the earthquakes that we are seeing, is because there is a loss of equilibrium that has happened. And as a species, we need to reinstate that equilibrium. And the first step towards doing that is empathy. We need to empathize with the planet, with nature. We need to understand how to coexist with this planet, because we are not mightier than nature. And that's the lesson to be learned here.
And ladies and gentlemen, I have nothing else to add to that. I want to thank my friend, Dr. Sheetal Verma, for
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
sharing just every ounce of who she is, how she became who she is, and empathize certainly with you as you're going through perhaps one of the most difficult parts of your life journey right now. We've got to talk, we've got to communicate together in these days that you've had to endure, and certainly I'm grateful for having played just a very small part in trying to understand what you're going through. And the healing has started, my friend, certainly even in conveying that story and the legacy of who your dad has been, and what you're doing next with the foundational work and providing that work. Please be sure to let me know as that gets underway, because certainly we would love to support you. We would love to talk much more about that as we go forward here as a group, as a family. And let's remember those amazing words that you've just shared. We've got to have empathy for each other. We've got to coexist together, and we need to start that right now.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, for the New Right Network, I'm Mario Nasinovich. To access this episode and all of our on-demand programming, all of the 11 episodes that we have done so far to date from Stealth on Health, please visit newrightnetwork.com. The right voice right now. Thank you for tuning in. Stay informed, stay healthy, and please be empathetic to each other.